Good afternoon, Professor and classmates. My group, consisting of Jericho, Kirsten, and myself, Boya, will be discussing the topic called Voiding the License to Discriminate, a discussion centered around fighting tokenism and promoting true diversity and inclusion. Without further ado, let's start with the case brief. Here is the discussion brief for our group. Feel free to pause this video to read it if you haven't. To start off, our group sat down to discuss some of the concepts around this topic. The first being, what is tokenism? We define this as a symbolic effort to create the impression of social inclusiveness and diversity, but results in superficial diversity without real inclusion. How does that happen? As mentioned before, tokens are usually given work that will be stereotypically suitable for their demographic, often stemming from biases that are subconsciously entrenched in the minds of the majority. Over time, there is no or little intention to improve the condition of the minority and really empower them in important decision-making processes. This results in a culture that we call aesthetically diverse but not attitudinally diverse. Another term that was mentioned is moral licensing. This refers to a form of psychological bargaining. When people initially behave in a moral way, they are more likely to display behaviors that are immoral, unethical, or problematic in other ways later. A simple example of this psychological bargaining would be how you feel acceptable to binge on junk food after a session in the gym. Another example is Harvey Weinstein, who claims to be feministic by going on a women's march and donating to Democrats, but was recently charged with sexually harassing women. In his mind, perhaps that he thought doing some form of good was sufficient to offset his wrongdoings. One of the most debated topics around tokenism is gender diversity, particularly female representation on corporate boards. This year, Goldman Sachs announced that starting from July 1, 2020, in the US and Europe, the bank will not take a company public unless there's at least one diverse board candidate, with a particular focus on women. This marks Goldman as the first Wall Street bank to declare such a policy. Goldman made its decision to insist on diverse candidates for IPO boards after its research showed that about 60 companies went public with all-male boards in Europe and the US in the past 2 years, while another 100 went public with only one female board member. While such a policy is indeed a well-intentioned and commendable move to champion diversity, we should ask, will this simply exacerbate tokenism for companies looking to IPO and become another box-ticking exercise? The answer to our question may well be yes. Before failing to IPO, co-working company WeWork had faced backlash over its all-male board. It responded by adding Harvard Business School professor Frances Frei to its board right before it tried to IPO. While Professor Frei is clearly experienced as she previously served as senior vice president at Uber Technologies, her addition to the board at such a short notice prompts us to think about tokenism. Therefore, firms looking to IPO with Goldman could simply just add a female board member to meet the new requirements. Interestingly, we noticed that SoftBank's board is equally imbalanced in gender with one female member as an independent officer. Could this poor corporate governance be one of the contributing factors towards its foolish investment in WeWork? Ken Bush welcomed Goldman's new stance, but said many investors wanted to ensure companies went beyond tokenism. He suggested raising the bar to at least 2 or 3 women on the board. But is this really a numbers game, or does it go beyond that? We should also be reminded that tokenism goes beyond gender representation to race, disability, socio-economic status, sexual orientation, education, and the list goes on. Let's take color for example. In the aftermath of George Floyd's death, corporates across the US were quick to declare that they too believe Black Lives Matter. But critics pointed to the near-complete absence of black people at the top of large corporates and the long-standing relative underrepresentation of the African American population. Just 4 Fortune 500 companies are run by black chief executives, and 37% of companies in the FTSE 100 had no non-white board members. Critics have also voiced concerns that companies have tended to focus on tokenism, believing that simply appointing a black person to the board addresses the issue. Tokenism is also a prevalent issue in marketing strategies. For example, after public outrage over Victoria's Secret CEO comments that he does not want to include the trans or plus-size community in his shows, Victoria's Secret decided to add token women of colour and size to their branding. One of its recent moves was a collaboration with UK-based lingerie brand Blue Bella, which is known for being inclusive in its products and marketing. It was also announced that plus-size model Ali Tate will be featured wearing pieces from the collaboration. But it's noteworthy that Victoria's Secret did not actually hire her. Blue Bella did. It is also apparent that these are tokenistic publicity efforts. Victoria's Secret has not put any of these diversity values into practice. Its advertisements and famous runway shows still largely feature slim white girls, and lingerie sizes in stores still cater to a small population. Next, I'll hand the time over to Kasim, who will share more about diversity management strategies.
Understand what is diversity. Now we can analyze why companies care about diversity. There are three major drivers encouraging organizations to implement diversity strategies. First, social justice. Being fair will help to build a company's reputation and meet the societal expectation of a responsible company, which will help them to attract talents and also attain more customers. Secondly, legal compliance. This legal act specifically mentions employer cannot discriminate against job applicants or employees during the course of their employment. For example, an employer must make reasonable adjustments when hiring someone with a disability. Lastly, industry standard employee environment protocols. These protocols set the standard procedure of how should a company, for example, conduct recruitment process and select employee on the basis of merit, regardless of age, race, gender, religion, marital status, and family responsibilities or disability. Taking PwC female representation as an example, we can see that in overall, from 2013 to 2019, the percentage of female in the management team has shown a growing trend due to their implementation of diversity programs. Globally, it has been a large shift in most organizations on increasing the representation of diverse groups in both the overall employee and leadership population in response to the changes in demographics. Therefore, companies strive to implement various diversity programs. Here are the list of companies that made it to the top. Some real-life practices including firms that are from different industries, which aim to bring diversity into their own firm through different efforts. Some practices including women-oriented business supply chain, culturally acceptable medical care service, ethnically diverse college program, and diversity education series. Although the intention was good, many companies struggle to increase the representation levels of diverse talents, and sometimes the diversity programs might even lead to negative impacts such as tokenism, a symbolic representation without being involved in the real decision-making process. According to Forbes, some possible reasons are: first, resistance. Resistance could be caused by several different things. For example, employees don't believe that the actual changes can be made, or they feel victimized. Second, improper implementation. A common strategy that companies utilize is to incorporate the diversity programs to simply just check the box. However, this doesn't guarantee that it will be effective. Next, lack of consistency. There is no specific sweet spot when it comes to how often programs should be implemented. Conducting training only once where an employee is hired will not be successful. Fourth, lack of leadership buy-in. Leaders could be resistant to change, believe that the change is not possible. Lastly, drop the diversity label. One study found that a white man exhibited more stress and anticipated more anti-white discrimination for a company that was pro-diversity versus a company that did not mention diversity. So developing a creative label for your program can reduce this resistance. The rises of the unsettling possibility that diversity programs aimed at influencing the worst offenders might backfire. Training designed to raise awareness about gender and race inequality may end up making gender and race more salient and thereby highlighting the differences. And the reason is because people have pretty low standard for convincing themselves that they are moral. A research done by Stanford University suggests that if people can't point to something particularly moral they have done recently, to show the non-resistant credentials. They will think about a lot of really resist things that they could have done, but they didn't actually do. One example can be what could happen if you have more women occupying low-status dean positions at a university. Our subconscious moral will license you to have only men in high-status dean positions. So we can see the paradox here. By having more vice presidents in the organization, actually reduce the likelihood that women will actually occupy the top position in the organization. And the root cause is due to the subconscious bias that we have, which are not addressed.
A solution to combat tokenism in the workplace is to have three elements enforced. Those three elements are diversity, equity, and lastly, inclusion. In order to reach equality in the workplace and hence eliminating tokenism, corporates must first have a diversity element. Diversity has been thoroughly discussed by Boya and Kasim, and I will move on to the next element. The next element that organizations would need is to have equity. So what does it mean to have equity? It means to provide fair treatment, access to resources, and opportunity of investment for everyone, both the majority and minority groups. The last element that is also the most difficult to attain is to have inclusion in the workplace. Having an inclusive environment in the workplace is equivalent to having an environment where minority groups can be and feel welcomed, respected, and valued to fully participate in the company's operations and decision-making processes. Most corporates fail to reach the last stage of equality in the workplace. They might have diversity since it's the easiest element to implement and the only element that can be reflected statistically or on paper. However, diversity without the complement of other two elements will inevitably lead to tokenism, like what Kasim has discussed. Our group has researched 4 approaches in combating tokenism in the workplace. The 4 approaches are to troubleshoot or detect whether tokenism exists in the company. Second is to prevent it from happening. Third is some behaviors members of the organization can adopt during day-to-day interaction. And lastly is a long-term approach to minimize tokenism. So how do we identify whether tokenism exists within our company? As managers and co-workers, we can ask ourselves whether the minority group in our team are given the tasks that they are expected to get. As a member of the majority group, tokenism can be extremely difficult to identify because it is done most of the time subconsciously. We get to really open our mind when asking this question to ourselves. Another way is to have an anonymous survey on the employee's engagement quality. As managers, we might think that all of our subordinates are under good care. However, again, that's the thing with tokenism. It is very difficult to spot, and even more, employees are quite reluctant in sharing their honest opinions regarding a workplace social condition, especially in the presence of their boss. We have to keep in mind that ensuring anonymity is key in getting an accurate representation of engagement quality in our workplace. In order to create a non-discriminatory and comfortable environment and boost productivity of employees, managers and co-workers would need to troubleshoot for tokenism periodically. A second approach and the best way to combat tokenism is to prevent it altogether. How do we prevent tokenism from happening? Firstly, be specific with what we want when recruiting. Recruiting employees of the minority group without a specific skill set or traits that a company really requires in order to just fulfill a certain diversity quota will inevitably lead to tokenism. There needs to be a set of guidelines on what kind of employees are the company really looking for. Another thing that we can do is to create a dedicated diverse committee that ensure and create policies that promote advancement of the minority. However, we gotta admit that this solution might not be feasible to all types of companies, especially small to micro enterprises due to resource constraint. And lastly, the best way to prevent tokenism is to change the mindset of the people in the organization on each behavior. It is important to not frame our behavior in terms of morality, like, for example, whether an act or program that I put in place is a good act or bad act. Doing this will only lead back to moral licensing because of our brain mechanism to balance self-image ledger. Instead, a way to think about each behavior that we portray is to think whether it leads to the relevant goal that we have, in this case, treating the minority group equally. Here's a catch though. How do we recognize whether we are trapped in a moral licensing situation? Unfortunately, it is indeed easier said than done. Humans are a combination of their behaviors. When our attention is constantly getting pulled, a moral licensing situation might slip unnoticed. And the best way to battle this is to practice mindfulness. Next is the discussion of how should we behave in a day-to-day interaction. One thing that managers mistakenly do is to highlight the differences that exist within a company. Highlighting these differences will only go against the values of equality in the workplace. Managers might do this with a genuine intention of having a non-discriminatory attitude. However, this would only further highlight that differences do exist, which in turn will make a social segregation between the two groups. An important element to have is to create a sense of belonging in the workplace. In order to achieve the last element of equality, which is again inclusion, both managers and coworkers must treat members of the minority groups as individuals and have the mindset of being genuinely interested in building a relationship with the minorities to create a sense of acceptance. Lastly is to be aware and mindful of who speaks in a meeting. Both managers and co-workers can put up a more conscious effort in keeping track whether the minorities have been given an equal chance to voice out their opinion. These three actions are the simple things that we can do to combat tokenism in the workplace. In the long run, it is important to note that the initial effect of tokenism in the minority group are at its worst at the beginning of their occupancy. Gradually, as the novelty wears off and recruiters increase members of the minority group, the work situation becomes more comfortable. Note that drastic increase of occupation might lead to stepped-up discrimination, which will lead to social segregation in the workplace. Another solution that is good to have is to have a feedback policy or system set in place where employees can easily give feedback to their working condition without having a confrontation with the majority group. Lastly, managers would need to monitor how long people from the minority group stay with the company. They can also conduct exit interviews or surveys to identify the flaw that exists within the organization's social structure. It should be noted that for all solutions mentioned throughout this presentation, that highlighting differences and being conscious of tokenism in the workplace are two different things. Special treatments of the minority group that does not put differences on a spotlight in the workplace is necessary to counterbalance the equity and inclusion that they are lacking at the beginning. Of course, in the long run, in order to create the ideal equality that we want, this treatment will need to be gradually erased. To recap and conclude our presentation, tokenism occurs when an effort to create diversity lacks the element of equity and inclusion. There has been increased awareness and efforts to promote diversity with the advent of social and human rights movement. However, the underlying issue of tokenism and moral licensing remains a prevalent problem even in developed countries. Cognitive bias, inconsistent efforts, and improper implementation are some reasons why companies fail to foster true diversity and inclusion. What companies should do is to perform an honest internal evaluation of the effectiveness of their diversity programs and measure its true impact with non-superficial metrics instead of measuring raw number of minority employees. And also, implement a variety of measures we mentioned earlier with the aim of promoting an inclusive culture, which can be done by both managers and fellow co-workers. And that will be the end of the presentation. Thank you.